Somewhere in the city that never truly sleeps, the quietest sound can change the course of a man's entire life. It was just after 4:30 a.m. in downtown Chicago when Staff Sergeant Jason Carter stepped out into the cold breath of the waking city, the kind of early morning where the streets still felt unfinished, like the world had not yet decided what kind of day it would become. The air carried a damp chill rolling in from the river, mixing with the distant scent of asphalt and coffee drifting from a 24-hour diner half a block away. Jason moved with the steady rhythm of a man who had spent years learning how to listen to silence, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket zipped to the collar, his boots striking the pavement in slow, deliberate steps. He had the posture of someone who had carried responsibility longer than comfort, his eyes scanning corners without thinking, not out of fear, but habit. The city around him was nearly empty, except for the occasional taxi rolling past with tired headlights, and a lone cyclist cutting through the intersection like a ghost. Then he heard it, a sound so faint it almost did not belong to the world at all. It came from somewhere between the narrow buildings ahead, a broken alleyway swallowed in shadow and flickering light. At first, Jason thought it was just the wind moving through metal and brick, but then it came again, softer this time, uneven, like something trying to call out, but losing strength halfway through. He stopped walking. The sound did not fit the city. It did not fit anything he knew. Slowly, instinct tightening in his chest, Jason turned toward the alley. The entrance was framed by a flickering street lamp that buzzed faintly overhead, casting light that stuttered like a failing heartbeat. The ground was uneven, scattered with damp cardboard, broken crates, and the quiet evidence of nights the city had already forgotten. And there, just beyond the threshold of light, he saw movement. Low to the ground. Small. Shaking. Jason stepped closer, each footfall slower now, more careful, as if the air itself had become fragile. The sound returned again, clearer this time, not just noise, but distress, shaped into something almost human in its urgency. He paused at the edge of the alley, letting his eyes adjust. What he saw made him go still. A German Shepherd K9 lay curled against the cold pavement, its coat dusted with rain from earlier in the night, its body trembling not from fear alone, but exhaustion. Around its neck was a worn collar, the kind used in service, the metal tag barely visible beneath the grime. Jason's breath slowed. He knew that posture. He had seen it before in training yards, in deployment zones, in moments where animals and men alike learned to survive more than they were meant to. "Hey," he said quietly, his voice lowering instinctively, not as a command, but as a presence trying not to startle. The dog's ears twitched at the sound, not lifting fully, not trusting yet, but listening. Jason took one step forward, then stopped again, reading every subtle movement like a language he had learned long ago and never forgotten. There was hesitation in the animal's body, a tension that spoke of broken trust rather than simple fear. Something had happened here before this moment, something that had left an invisible mark deeper than the visible ones. Jason crouched slowly, keeping distance, letting silence do the work between them. The city noise faded behind him until all that remained was the faint hum of the streetlight and the uneven rhythm of breathing in the cold air. The dog shifted slightly, as if considering escape, but it did not move away. Instead, it looked at him. Not fully, not openly, but enough for their eyes to meet in a fractured kind of understanding. Jason felt something tighten in his chest, not urgency, not alarm, but recognition of something he could not yet name. He had seen that kind of exhaustion before, not just in bodies, but in spirits that had carried too much for too long. He reached slowly into his pocket, not offering anything yet, just making his presence known in a way that asked for permission instead of demanding obedience. The dog did not retreat. It only watched, as if deciding whether the world still made sense. And in that fragile moment between fear and trust, Jason Carter realized this was not just a chance encounter in an empty alleyway, but the beginning of something neither of them was prepared for, something that would pull them both toward a truth buried deeper than the silence around them. The alleyway seemed to grow quieter the longer Jason Carter stood there, as if the entire city had instinctively lowered its voice around what lay in the shadows. The faint hum of traffic from the main street felt distant now, separated by layers of brick and time, leaving only the narrow corridor of damp concrete and flickering light. Jason remained still, carefully controlling his breathing the way he had been trained to do in uncertain environments, not because he sensed danger, but because he understood fragility when he saw it. The German shepherd in front of him shifted slightly, its front paws pressing against the cold ground as though testing whether the world would hold its weight. Jason noticed details the way he always did. The uneven wear on the collar, the faint discoloration where a service tag had once been attached, the subtle tension in the shoulders that suggested discipline even in exhaustion. This was not a stray animal. That much was certain. Somewhere in its past, structure and training had existed, and then something had fractured it. He slowly lowered himself further into a crouch, keeping his hands visible and open, letting silence carry more meaning than words. The dog's eyes tracked him cautiously, alert but conflicted, as if every instinct was divided between approach and retreat. Jason spoke again, his voice steady and low, careful not to echo too sharply off the walls. "It is okay. I am not here to hurt you." The words were simple, but they carried weight shaped by years of situations where tone mattered more than volume. The dog did not respond, but its ears shifted slightly, adjusting to him, measuring him. A long moment passed, filled only by the sound of distant water dripping from a broken pipe somewhere above them. Jason took a slow breath and glanced around the alley once more. No movement, no footsteps, no other presence. Just the two of them and the lingering trace of something that had happened before he arrived. The dog tried to lift its head, but the motion was weak, interrupted by fatigue. Jason noticed immediately and instinctively shifted his weight forward a few inches, not closing distance too quickly, but reducing the space enough to show intent without pressure. That small adjustment seemed to matter. The dog's body tensed, then relaxed slightly, as if debating whether to accept the change. Jason studied the pattern of its behavior, recognizing hesitation that went beyond physical exhaustion. This was emotional resistance, the kind that came after trust had been broken. He had seen it before, not only in animals, but in people who had learned to expect disappointment from anything that approached too gently. A soft sound escaped the dog again, quieter now, almost like a question instead of a cry. Jason tilted his head slightly, listening. "You are not alone," he said, more to the moment than to the animal, because sometimes words were meant to anchor reality rather than explain it. The German shepherd's gaze flickered briefly toward the street behind Jason, then back to him, as if checking for permission from an unseen memory. Jason followed that instinctive glance, scanning the exit of the alley. Still nothing. But something about that reaction told him more than silence ever could. Whatever had brought this animal here was not random. It had direction, history, and weight. Slowly, Jason reached into the inner pocket of his jacket again, not for anything threatening, but for a small cloth he carried for moments like this, something neutral, something that did not belong to force or authority. He placed it on the ground between them, not pushing it forward, simply letting it exist as an offering without expectation. The dog watched the movement carefully. For several seconds, neither of them moved. The city seemed to hold its breath with them. Then, almost imperceptibly, the dog shifted forward by a fraction of an inch. Not enough to close distance, but enough to signal awareness beyond fear. Jason did not react. He simply remained steady, allowing time to do what urgency never could. In that stillness, something subtle changed. The tension in the dog's shoulders eased, not fully, not completely, but enough to suggest that survival instinct was no longer the only voice speaking inside it. Jason's expression softened slightly, though his focus never left the animal. He had learned long ago that trust was not given in moments of comfort, but in the space where discomfort no longer felt like a threat. A faint sound of metal shifting echoed from deeper within the alley, somewhere beyond their immediate sight. The dog reacted instantly, head turning sharply, body tightening again as if memory itself had been triggered. Jason remained still, observing rather than reacting, understanding that not every response belonged to the present moment. Whatever the sound meant, it belonged to a past neither of them had stepped into yet. When the silence returned, the dog slowly looked back at Jason, but this time the hesitation had changed shape. It was no longer purely defensive. It was uncertain, searching, as if something inside it was beginning to question whether it still needed to be alone. Jason exhaled slowly, keeping his posture unchanged. He did not reach closer. He did not speak again. He simply stayed, because sometimes presence was the only language that did not demand anything in return. And in that quiet exchange, the boundary between stranger and connection began to thin, not broken, not resolved, but shifting just enough to suggest that neither of them would leave this alleyway unchanged. The moment between Jason Carter and the German Shepherd had settled into a fragile kind of silence, the kind that did not feel empty, but instead felt carefully balanced, as if any sudden movement might shift something irreversible. The alleyway around them remained unchanged in shape, but not in atmosphere. The flickering street lamp above continued its uneven rhythm, casting light that pulsed softly across the damp ground like a fading heartbeat. Jason stayed in his crouched position, patient and grounded, his attention fully anchored on the animal in front of him. The German Shepherd's breathing had slowed slightly, though its posture still carried traces of caution, as if rest itself was not yet fully safe. Jason noticed the way its gaze kept returning to him, not constantly, but in intervals, as though checking whether he was still real, still present. He had seen that behavior before in working dogs that had been displaced from their units, animals that once depended on structure and command and then found themselves without either. A faint sound broke the stillness again, this time closer to the entrance of the alley, a metallic scrape followed by distant footsteps that paused and faded. The dog reacted instantly, its body tightening, ears lifting, head turning toward the sound with sharp alertness. Jason did not move. He simply observed, understanding that reactions like that were not random. They were memory responses. Whoever this animal had been with, wherever it had come from, it had learned to associate certain sounds with meaning. Jason slowly shifted his weight just slightly, not toward the dog, but into a more stable stance, signaling calm rather than pursuit. The dog's attention returned to him after a moment, but the tension did not fully leave. Jason spoke again, softer this time, as if trying not to disturb the fragile space between them. "You are safe here. Whatever happened before, it is not happening now." The words were not a promise of control, but an acknowledgement of the present moment. The dog's ears lowered slightly, uncertain, as though processing something deeper than language. Jason noticed the subtle change and remained quiet, letting the silence do the work. A long pause followed, broken only by the distant hum of the city waking further into morning. Somewhere far off, a bus engine started, and a series of footsteps echoed briefly before disappearing into another street. The alley, however, remained its own enclosed world, separate from the flow of time outside it. Jason shifted his gaze briefly to the worn collar around the dog's neck. The material was scuffed, edges softened from use, and there was a faint impression where a tag had once been attached. That absence told a story without words. He did not reach for it. Instead, he slowly removed his jacket from one arm and laid it gently on the ground a few feet closer, creating a small barrier of warmth between himself and the cold pavement. The dog watched every movement closely, eyes tracking the fabric as it settled. For a moment, it did not move. Then, cautiously, it lowered its head slightly, as if acknowledging the presence of something unfamiliar but not threatening. Jason remained still, his breathing steady, his posture open. There was no command in his voice, no expectation in his stance, only patience. The German Shepherd shifted again, this time more slowly, dragging its front paw forward by a few inches. The motion was small, but intentional. Jason did not react outwardly, though internally he registered the significance of it. Trust, even in its smallest form, rarely arrived fully formed. It came in fragments, in pauses, in decisions made against instinct. The dog stopped again, watching him, as if waiting for correction or consequence. None came. Jason simply stayed. The silence between them grew deeper, not uncomfortable, but concentrated. In that space, something unspoken began to settle. The dog's breathing evened out further, and the tension in its shoulders eased just enough to be noticeable. Jason could see the shift, not as transformation, but as possibility. Then, from deeper within the alley, another sound emerged, softer than before, almost like a distant echo carried by wind. The dog's head snapped slightly in that direction, but this time it did not fully retreat into fear. Instead, it hesitated, caught between old instinct and new uncertainty. Jason followed its gaze briefly, scanning the darker end of the alley, but still saw nothing. Whatever lay beyond their immediate sight remained hidden, but not irrelevant. It lingered like a question neither of them had yet answered. Jason returned his attention to the dog, keeping his voice calm and steady. "Whatever you are waiting for, you do not have to wait alone." The words were simple, but they carried weight shaped by experience, not theory. The dog blinked slowly, then shifted its gaze back to him, holding it for longer than before. The distance between them had not physically changed much, but something intangible had moved. The space no longer felt like separation. It felt like transition. And in that quiet, between broken trust and uncertain hope, both man and animal remained exactly where they were, as if standing on the edge of a decision neither of them fully understood yet, but both were beginning to choose. The silence between Jason Carter and the German Shepherd had changed again, not dramatically, not in a way that could be immediately named, but enough that it no longer felt like two separate presences sharing the same space. The alleyway still held its damp, cold air, still carried the faint scent of rain and concrete, but something inside it had softened, as if the tension that once filled every corner had begun to loosen its grip. Jason remained still, watching the animal carefully, not because he feared it, but because he respected how fragile trust could be when it was still forming. The German Shepherd had not moved much since the last shift in their interaction, yet its eyes no longer carried the same sharp uncertainty. Instead, there was something closer to curiosity, mixed with hesitation that felt less like fear and more like memory trying to decide whether it was safe to surface. Jason slowly lowered his gaze to the collar again, studying it more carefully this time. The worn leather had a faint imprint of engraved lettering, though time and weather had blurred most of it. He leaned slightly forward, not crossing the invisible boundary between them, just enough to read what he could. The name was partially visible. One word stood out more than the rest. Shadow. Jason did not speak immediately. He let the name settle in his mind, not as identification, but as recognition of structure. Military working dogs were never nameless. They were assigned, trained, bonded, and remembered. Something about this one carried that same disciplined history, now fractured. He looked back at the animal and spoke softly, almost as if testing the weight of the name in the open air. Shadow. The reaction was immediate, but not explosive. The German Shepherd's ears lifted slightly, then paused mid-position, as if the sound had struck a place deeper than simple recognition. Its body stiffened for a brief moment, then slowly relaxed again, but this time differently than before. There was confusion, yes, but also something that resembled awareness returning through fog. Jason noticed the shift and did not repeat the name. Instead, he remained quiet, allowing the moment to unfold without pressure. The dog blinked once, slowly, its gaze narrowing slightly as if trying to connect fragments of something buried beneath exhaustion. Jason could see the internal conflict playing out without needing to interpret it fully. This was not just a stray animal reacting to sound. This was something trained, something conditioned, something that remembered more than it was currently able to express. A faint sound echoed from the far end of the alley again, but this time neither of them reacted immediately. The sound passed like background noise, absorbed by the city beyond, no longer commanding attention. Jason shifted his weight carefully, extending one hand slightly closer to the ground, not toward the dog's body, but toward the space in front of it. The gesture was not an invitation to move forward, but a signal of presence without force. "You do not have to decide anything right now," he said calmly, his voice steady, almost blending with the quiet surroundings. The German Shepherd stared at his hand for a long moment. Then, with visible hesitation, it lowered its head slightly, not fully trusting, but no longer fully resisting either. The change was subtle, but in situations like this, subtle was everything. Jason did not move closer. He understood that rushing this moment would undo it entirely. Instead, he slowly reached for the jacket he had placed earlier and adjusted it slightly, spreading it more open on the ground, creating a warmer and more visible space between them. The dog's eyes followed the motion, then returned to Jason, as if evaluating whether this was a continuation of safety or the beginning of expectation. Jason met its gaze without challenge. The connection between them was not built on command or authority, but on shared stillness. Then, after several seconds that felt longer than they were, the German Shepherd shifted again. This time, it moved its front paw forward, just enough to cross a small portion of distance it had previously refused to enter. Jason did not acknowledge it outwardly, but internally he understood what it meant. Trust was not being given fully, but it was no longer being withheld completely. From somewhere outside the alley, a distant engine passed, tires rolling over wet pavement. The sound did not interrupt them. It simply existed alongside them, part of a world they were still connected to but temporarily separated from. Jason exhaled slowly, his posture still unchanged. "That is enough for now," he said quietly, not as instruction, but as acknowledgement. The German Shepherd remained where it was, but its breathing had steadied further, and the rigid tension in its frame had softened into something more uncertain but less defensive. Jason could see it now not as an encounter interrupted by circumstance, but as a crossing point, where whatever came next would no longer be defined by survival alone. It would be defined by choice. And in that quiet space between past fracture and uncertain future, both man and animal remained, no longer strangers bound by coincidence, but two presences beginning, carefully and without certainty, to recognize each other. The alleyway felt different now, not in its physical structure, but in the way silence no longer felt like emptiness. It felt shared. Jason Carter remained in his crouched position, but the tension in his shoulders had eased slightly, as if the environment itself had shifted from confrontation into something more fragile and uncertain. The German Shepherd, still marked by exhaustion and hesitation, stood in the same place, but its posture had changed in subtle ways that only careful observation would reveal. Its head was lower now, not pressed down in fear, but resting in a neutral position that suggested the constant internal struggle between caution and curiosity was beginning to quiet. Jason did not move closer. He understood that this moment could not be rushed without breaking it. Instead, he kept his presence steady, allowing time to do what force never could. The air between them felt heavier in a different way now, no longer charged with resistance, but filled with a kind of suspended possibility. Jason slowly shifted his gaze toward the far end of the alley again, not because anything had changed there, but because awareness of surroundings was a habit that never fully disappeared. The city beyond continued its slow transition into morning, distant sounds of movement growing slightly more frequent, though still muffled by the narrow walls surrounding them. Somewhere out of sight, a metal gate clanged softly, followed by footsteps that faded before they reached the alley entrance. The German Shepherd reacted faintly to the sound, lifting its ears, but this time it did not retreat or stiffen fully. Instead, it glanced toward Jason almost immediately afterward, as if checking whether his reaction would define its own. Jason noticed that shift clearly. It was not obedience, and it was not fear. It was evaluation. He kept his voice low, and even when he finally spoke, "You are safe here. No one is going to force you to move." The words were not meant to command, but to remove pressure from the space between them. The dog blinked slowly, holding his gaze for a longer moment than before. Jason could see fatigue still present in its body, but beneath it there was now something else beginning to surface, something closer to trust, but not yet willing to fully name itself. He carefully adjusted his position, shifting one knee slightly forward to ease the strain in his stance. The movement was slow, deliberate, and non-threatening. The German Shepherd tracked it, but did not react negatively. Jason reached for the edge of his jacket on the ground again and gently pulled it closer to himself, not removing it from the space, but reshaping its position to remain visible and available without forcing proximity. The dog watched this carefully, its eyes following every motion with quiet intensity. For several seconds, nothing else happened. The alley remained still except for the faint drip of water from above and the distant hum of the waking city. Then, very slowly, the German Shepherd lowered its body further, shifting its weight backward slightly before settling into a more stable stance. It was not surrender, and it was not acceptance in full, but it was no longer resistance. Jason observed this carefully, understanding that in moments like this, progress was measured in fractions rather than steps. He did not speak again. Instead, he allowed silence to continue shaping the interaction. The dog's breathing gradually became more even, no longer broken by sharp tension. Jason noticed the subtle change in rhythm, the way exhaustion and awareness were beginning to balance each other rather than conflict. A faint breeze moved through the alley, carrying cooler air from the open street. The German Shepherd's ears shifted slightly in response, but its body remained grounded. Jason slowly lifted his hand again, not advancing, not offering contact, but simply allowing the gesture to exist in the space between them once more. The dog looked at it for a long time, then back at Jason, then back at the hand again. Something inside it seemed to be recalibrating, not toward fear, but toward decision. Jason did not pressure the moment. He had learned that trust built under urgency rarely survived it. Instead, he remained still, his expression calm, his presence steady, offering nothing but consistency. The alleyway around them seemed to narrow into focus, as if the rest of the world had been temporarily reduced to this single exchange. The German Shepherd finally shifted forward just slightly, not closing the distance entirely, but reducing it enough to mark a change that could not be undone. Jason did not react outwardly, but he recognized the significance immediately. This was not resolution. It was the beginning of permission. And in that quiet space where uncertainty no longer felt like danger, both man and animal remained, suspended between what had been survived and what had not yet been decided. The alleyway no longer felt like a place where two strangers were trapped in uncertainty, but rather a narrow space where something delicate was slowly forming, something that had not yet been named but was already being understood. Jason Carter remained still, his posture unchanged, but the awareness in his expression had softened in a way that reflected recognition rather than analysis. The German Shepherd stood a few feet away, now closer than before, not because it had been forced, but because it had chosen not to retreat. Its body still carried signs of exhaustion, but the tension that once defined every muscle had begun to dissolve into something quieter, something that resembled caution balanced with curiosity. Jason observed this carefully, understanding that moments like this did not announce themselves with clarity. They unfolded in silence, in hesitation, in the space between instinct and decision. The air around them felt cooler now, as if the early morning had fully settled into the city. Somewhere beyond the alley, life continued to move forward, distant traffic signals changing, tires rolling over wet pavement, voices beginning to rise in scattered conversations. But here, inside this narrow corridor of brick and shadow, time seemed to behave differently. Jason slowly shifted his weight, easing the pressure on his legs, but he did not stand. He did not want to break the fragile rhythm that had formed. The German Shepherd watched him closely, its head tilting slightly, as if trying to interpret intention rather than action. Jason spoke again, his voice calm and steady, carrying no urgency. "You do not have to move any further than you want to." The words were simple, but they were not empty. They were an acknowledgement of autonomy, something that the animal appeared to understand in its own way. The dog blinked slowly, then lowered its head slightly, not in submission, but in a kind of measured acceptance of the present moment. Jason noticed the subtle change immediately. It was not dramatic, but it was meaningful. The distance between them still existed, yet it no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like a choice. He allowed his gaze to drift briefly toward the entrance of the alley again. The street beyond had grown slightly brighter, the gray tones of morning deepening into a muted glow that reflected off wet pavement. A delivery truck passed somewhere nearby, its engine noise briefly filling the air before fading again into distance. The German Shepherd reacted faintly to the sound, ears lifting, body tightening for a brief second, then relaxing once it recognized there was no immediate threat. Jason noted the response, but did not comment. Instead, he remained focused on the animal's breathing, which had now become more consistent, less fractured by uncertainty. He slowly adjusted his position again, this time shifting one hand onto his knee for support, a subtle movement that signaled patience rather than pursuit. The dog watched this carefully, its eyes tracking every motion, as if trying to determine whether human stillness could truly be trusted. Jason did not attempt to interpret its thoughts. He simply remained present. After several long seconds, the German Shepherd took another small step forward. This movement was slower than the previous one, more deliberate, as if tested against invisible boundaries. Jason did not react outwardly. He kept his posture steady, his expression calm, allowing the action to exist without influence. The space between them narrowed again, not significantly, but enough to mark progression. The dog stopped once more, observing him. There was still hesitation in its stance, but it was no longer accompanied by retreat. Jason exhaled quietly, almost imperceptibly, acknowledging the shift without disrupting it. He lowered his gaze slightly, not breaking eye contact entirely, but softening the intensity of it. "You are doing fine," he said gently. The words meant not as instruction, but as reassurance that presence did not require perfection. The German Shepherd held his gaze for a moment longer than before. Then, slowly, it shifted its attention to the jacket still lying partially on the ground between them. The fabric had become slightly damp from the air, but it remained a visible marker of space that was no longer threatening. The dog leaned forward just enough to lower its nose toward it, stopping just short of contact. Jason remained completely still, understanding that even this minimal movement represented a significant decision. The moment stretched quietly, uninterrupted by sound or interruption. Then, after what felt like a suspended breath in time, the dog withdrew slightly, not out of fear, but out of consideration. Jason accepted this without reaction. Trust, he understood, did not always move in a straight line. It paused, it retreated slightly, it recalibrated. And in that recalibration, progress was often made invisible to anyone not paying attention closely enough. The alley remained unchanged in structure, but its meaning had shifted entirely. What had begun as an encounter defined by uncertainty was now becoming something shaped by recognition. Jason remained where he was, steady and patient, while the German Shepherd stood just a little closer than before, no longer fully alone in its space, and not yet fully joined to his. The alleyway had settled into a different kind of stillness now, one that no longer felt like two separate lives intersecting by chance, but like a shared space slowly being rewritten by patience alone. Jason Carter remained in the same crouched position, though his body language had softened further, no longer rigid with assessment, but steady with acceptance. The German Shepherd stood only a few steps away now, closer than before, its presence no longer confined to hesitation alone. There was still caution in its stance, but it had changed shape, no longer pushing outward in resistance, but holding inward in thought. Jason could see it clearly now, the way the animal's breathing had steadied, the way its head no longer snapped toward every distant sound with alarm, but instead evaluated them with something closer to memory than fear. The early morning light outside the alley had grown stronger, filtering in at an angle that painted the damp ground in soft gray and muted gold tones. Somewhere beyond the narrow passage, the city had fully awakened, engines starting, distant voices carrying across intersections, the rhythm of daily life resuming as if nothing within this space had shifted at all. But here, inside this small corridor of silence and shadow, everything had changed in ways that could not be measured by time alone. Jason slowly adjusted his posture again, not standing, not advancing, simply easing the strain in his muscles while maintaining complete stillness and intention. The German Shepherd watched this carefully, its head tilting slightly, as if recalibrating its understanding of what movement meant. In this context, Jason spoke again, his voice low, steady, and calm, each word shaped to avoid disruption rather than command. "You are still in control of your space. Nothing here is going to take that away from you." The words lingered between them, not as instruction, but as reassurance that presence did not require surrender. The dog blinked slowly, holding his gaze for a longer moment than before, and Jason noticed that the intensity in its eyes had softened just slightly. It was not trust in its final form, but it was no longer pure defense. It was something more uncertain, something that carried the weight of consideration. A faint sound echoed from deeper within the alley again, a distant metallic clink followed by silence. The German Shepherd reacted, but not immediately. Its ears lifted, then paused, then lowered again as it recognized there was no immediate threat attached to the sound. Jason observed this shift carefully. The delay in reaction mattered more than the reaction itself. It meant the instinct to flee or resist was no longer automatic. He remained silent, allowing the moment to exist without interference. The air between them felt less compressed now, as if space itself had begun to open rather than close. Jason slowly extended his attention back to the animal, noticing the subtle way it shifted its weight from one paw to another, testing stability not just in its body, but in its environment. The jacket he had placed earlier remained between them, slightly damp now from the morning air, serving as a quiet marker of boundary and possibility. The dog lowered its head slightly toward it again, but this time there was no withdrawal afterward. Instead, it lingered there for a longer moment, as if deciding whether proximity carried consequence or simply presence. Jason did not move. He understood that this moment did not belong to him. It belonged entirely to the animal's decision. After several seconds, the German Shepherd took another small step forward. This movement was not hesitant in the same way as before. It was slower, more deliberate, as if it had weighed every instinct against a newly forming understanding. Jason did not react outwardly, but internally he registered the significance of the shift. The distance between them was now small enough that presence could no longer be questioned, only interpreted. The dog stopped again, closer than before, and looked directly at him. This time, the gaze held longer without breaking. Jason allowed his expression to remain neutral but open, offering nothing that could be mistaken for pressure. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with recognition that neither side fully understood yet, but both were beginning to accept. Jason spoke one more time, softer than before, almost blending into the surrounding air. "You do not have to decide anything beyond this moment." The German Shepherd exhaled slowly, a sound that carried both fatigue and release, and for the first time since Jason had entered the alley, its posture lowered without hesitation or recoil. It did not collapse into rest, nor did it fully relax, but it allowed itself to exist without resistance. Jason remained exactly where he was, steady and still, understanding that nothing more needed to happen for this moment to matter. And in the quiet space between uncertainty and connection, both man and animal remained present, not yet bound, not yet separated, but standing together on the edge of something that had finally begun to feel like understanding. The moment stretched inside the alleyway like a thin thread balancing between silence and meaning, neither breaking nor fully settling, simply existing in a state of fragile acceptance. Jason Carter remained in his crouched position. Though his body had grown more relaxed than before, his posture no longer shaped by caution alone, but by a steady recognition that the situation was no longer unstable in the way it had been at the beginning. The German Shepherd stood closer now, its presence no longer anchored at a distance of defense, but within a space that suggested reluctant trust. Its breathing had slowed significantly, no longer sharp or uneven, but measured, as if the body was finally beginning to remember what rest felt like without immediately questioning it. Jason observed this carefully, his attention steady, not intrusive, but fully present. The early morning light outside the alley had shifted again, growing slightly brighter, reflecting off wet pavement in soft fragments of gray and muted white. The city beyond continued its motion, unaware of the quiet transformation happening within this narrow corridor. Somewhere in the distance, a car horn sounded briefly, then faded into the rhythm of traffic. None of it reached them in a way that disrupted what had formed here. Jason slowly adjusted his hand position, resting it lightly on his knee, keeping every movement deliberate and non-threatening. The German Shepherd's eyes followed the motion, but this time without the sharp tension that had once defined its reactions. There was still caution present, but it had softened into something closer to observation than resistance. Jason spoke again, his voice lower than before, steady and calm, shaped by patience rather than intention. "You are still here. That is what matters right now." The words did not ask for response, nor did they attempt to guide behavior. They simply acknowledged existence in the present moment. The dog blinked slowly, then shifted its weight slightly, not stepping back, not stepping forward, but stabilizing in place. Jason noticed the subtle change immediately. Stability, even in small amounts, carried meaning in situations like this. He remained still, allowing the silence to continue shaping the space between them. A faint breeze passed through the alley, carrying cooler air that brushed lightly against both man and animal. The German Shepherd reacted minimally, only a slight movement of its ears, but no return to tension followed. Jason could see it more clearly now, the gradual reduction of internal conflict. The body was no longer preparing for escape at every sound. It was beginning to evaluate the possibility of remaining. Jason slowly exhaled, keeping his gaze steady but soft. The jacket on the ground between them remained undisturbed, its presence now less of a barrier and more of a shared point of reference. The dog looked toward it again, but instead of hesitation, there was a longer pause, as if it were measuring the meaning of proximity itself. Jason did not intervene. He understood that any decision made under pressure would not hold. After several seconds, the German Shepherd lowered its head slightly and shifted forward by another small step. The movement was controlled, intentional, and noticeably different from earlier attempts. It was no longer driven by uncertainty alone. It carried a sense of choice. Jason did not react outwardly, but he registered the significance internally. The distance between them had narrowed further, now close enough that presence no longer required interpretation, only acknowledgement. The dog stopped again, closer than before, and remained still. Its eyes met Jason's, and this time the contact did not break quickly. Jason kept his expression calm, offering nothing that could be mistaken for demand. He simply remained as he was, steady and open, allowing the moment to exist without shaping it. The silence between them felt different now. It no longer carried tension or waiting. It carried recognition. Jason spoke once more, softer than before, almost blending into the air itself. "You do not have to prove anything here." The German Shepherd blinked, then slowly lowered itself further, not collapsing, not retreating, but settling into a more grounded position. The movement was gradual, controlled, and deliberate, as if testing whether stillness itself was safe. Jason remained exactly where he was, not closing the space, not increasing it, simply honoring what had been offered. The alleyway around them felt unchanged, but its meaning had shifted entirely. What had begun as separation had evolved into shared presence, not complete trust, not resolution, but something real enough to remain. And in that quiet space between uncertainty and acceptance, both man and animal stayed together, no longer defined by distance, but by the possibility of staying. The alleyway no longer felt like a place suspended between two strangers, but like a space that had quietly transformed into something neither of them had named, yet both were beginning to understand. Jason Carter remained still, his posture steady, his breathing calm, no longer shaped by caution alone, but by the quiet awareness that movement was no longer necessary to maintain trust. The German Shepherd lay closer now than before, its body finally lowered into a resting position that did not signal retreat or fear, but a fragile acceptance of presence. The early morning light outside the alley had grown warmer, filtering through the narrow opening in soft tones of gray and gold, touching the damp ground and broken pavement with a quiet sense of continuity that contrasted the stillness inside. The city beyond had fully awakened now, with distant engines, scattered footsteps, and the faint rhythm of a world continuing forward without pause. But within this narrow corridor, everything remained focused on a single shared moment. Jason slowly adjusted his position, easing the strain in his legs, while keeping his presence consistent and calm. He did not move closer, nor did he increase distance. He simply remained. The German Shepherd lifted its head slightly, its eyes now softer than before, no longer scanning for threat with immediate urgency, but observing with a quiet, measured awareness that suggested something deeper than instinct alone. Jason spoke again, his voice steady and low, almost blending into the surrounding air. "You do not have to stay if you are not ready, but you are not alone in this moment." The words did not demand response, nor did they attempt to define outcome. They simply existed as acknowledgement. The dog blinked slowly, then exhaled through its nose, a subtle release of tension that had not been present earlier. Jason noticed the change immediately. It was not dramatic, but it was meaningful in its restraint. The German Shepherd shifted slightly, adjusting its weight, as if testing whether stillness itself was now acceptable. The jacket Jason had placed earlier remained between them, no longer a barrier, but a quiet marker of shared space. The dog's gaze drifted toward it briefly, then returned to Jason, holding longer than before, without hesitation or withdrawal. Jason kept his expression calm, his attention steady, offering nothing that could be interpreted as pressure. He understood now that this moment was not about progression, but about stability. After several seconds, the German Shepherd slowly lifted its front body, not fully standing, but rising just enough to reposition itself closer by a few inches. The movement was careful, controlled, and entirely self-directed. Jason did not react outwardly, but internally he recognized the significance. This was no longer resistance. It was engagement without fear. The dog paused again, now noticeably closer than before, and remained still. The space between them had narrowed to a point where presence no longer required interpretation. Jason slowly lowered his gaze slightly, softening his focus without breaking awareness. "That is enough for now," he said quietly, not as instruction, but as recognition that no further movement was needed to validate what had already occurred. The German Shepherd remained where it was, its breathing steady, its posture no longer defensive, but grounded in a way that suggested exhaustion had finally stopped competing with awareness. Jason stayed exactly as he was, neither advancing nor withdrawing, understanding that trust at this stage was not measured in distance, but in continuity. A faint sound echoed from the street outside, a passing vehicle followed by the distant hum of morning activity. None of it disrupted the space they occupied. The alleyway, once defined by separation, now felt like a shared threshold between uncertainty and calm. Jason remained silent for several more moments, allowing the stillness to settle completely. The German Shepherd did not move away. It did not retreat into old patterns. It simply remained present, no longer alone in its space, no longer isolated within its own response. And in that quiet conclusion of motion and resistance, both man and animal stayed together, not as resolution, but as something far more fragile and real, the beginning of trust that did not need to be spoken to exist.